All right, so our lesson today actually comes from one of the appendices of our book. So we're doing this is an appendix 5. So we're just going to have a quick reminder on how we go about solving a quadratic equation by completing the square. We're actually in the appendix of the book. So this is appendix section 5 is what it is. All right, so just again, just a quick review, a little bit of a reminder to kind of get us back into doing this. A quadratic equation. Quadratic equation, what we call in this book, they call it the general form. And this should look familiar. Ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. So this is a quadratic equation. And for this, we don't want a equals 0, because if a is 0, then it's actually not a quadratic equation. Then it's a linear equation. So a quadratic equation, we have everything on one side and a 0 on the other. I've said that so many times to my geometry students in the last semester for quadratic equations. That's to solve a quadratic equation, we want everything on one side and a 0 on the other. The other way that we can talk about these, and we'll get into this in a little more detail in chapter 2, this is a second degree polynomial equation. And we're going to, in chapter 2, we're going to expand on polynomial equations quite a bit, but we'll start out by talking about quadratic equations and quadratic functions, and we just want to just do a little bit of review. Completing the square is one thing that's easy to forget, or easy to want to forget, I guess, but that we end up needing to do. So we want to solve this by completing the square. So our steps, the steps for solving by completing the squares. Completing the square. I'm going to say that if the first thing we want to do, if we have our equation set up like this, my first step, if a doesn't equal 1, so if a is some number other than 1, divide everything by a first. So if we have some number out here in front of the x squared, and we have an equation like this, to solve by completing the square, the first thing we're going to do is divide everything by a. So our second step, we're going to add. Does anybody remember what we add when we complete the square? It has to do with b. Add b over 2 squared to both sides. Our third step, once we do this, we can rewrite the left side as a perfect square. And then our last step, once we write the left side as a perfect square, then we can just use square roots to finish. So those are our steps for solving a quadratic equation. When we have it written like this, solving this using completing the square. The important thing to remember for completing the square is adding this b over 2 squared. That's the important thing to remember. So all we're going to do is look at a couple of examples of solving by completing the square. So the first example, we have x squared plus 8x minus 3 equals 0. And we're solving by completing the square. So for this one, this is nice. Here we have a equals 1. The number in front of the x squared is just 1. So I don't have to worry about the a. So the first thing that I'm going to do is add b over 2 squared to both sides. So for this equation, what is b? 8. B equals 8. B over 2 squared is going to be 8 over 2 is 4, squared is 16. So I'm going to add 16 to both sides. So I'm going to say that this is x squared plus 8x plus 16. I'm going to put a minus 3, and I'm going to add 16 to this side also. Now I'm going to take this part. This part turns into a perfect square. That's why completing the square is nice. X squared plus 8x plus 16. I'm going to rewrite that as a perfect square. So by a perfect square I mean x plus or minus something squared. So what would this be? X plus 4 squared. Because I can factor this as x plus 4 times x plus 4. So x plus 4 squared minus 3 equals 16. I want to get this squared part by itself, so I'm going to add 3 to both sides. So x plus 4 squared equals 19. And then to solve this, I can just take the square root of both sides. My last step was to use square roots to finish. So I take the square root of both sides, and I get the square root undoes the square. I get x plus 4 equals, and when I take the square root, what do I have to be careful of here? Plus or minus. I always get a plus or minus. X plus 4 equals plus or minus the square root of 19. And then I'm solving for x, so I'm going to subtract 4 from both sides. X equals negative 4 plus or minus the square root of 19. This would be my exact answer. If the problem asks you for a decimal answer or approximation, we would plug 19 into our calculator, take the square root, add it to -4, and subtract it from -4 to get my two approximate answers. I guess this should say exact answers. And I could have put one other step in my steps to begin with. When I solve by completing the square, I can get this part by itself on one side of the equation first. So I could have added the 3 to the other side of the equation to start off with before I did all of this. So if you would like, on your steps, if you want to add that to your steps, I would put that in here. I'm going to put it as 1.5. Get x squared plus bx by itself. You don't have to do it that way. It can be easier. You can do it either way. So I could have started off here by getting the x squared plus 8x by itself on one side by adding 3 to both sides.
Can you go back?
Yes. Okay. So I'm just going to do one more example where we have to deal with an a first, where we have a number in front of the x squared, and that's really all we're going to do today. So let's look. Any questions on this one before we go on? Okay. And we'll be doing more completing the square as we move on. So let's look at our second example. And we want to solve by completing the square again. So here we have a equals 2. So we have this number in front of the x squared. So our first step when we're solving by completing the square is divide everything by a. So we're going to divide everything by 2 first. So I'm going to divide everything by 2. So when I divide 2x squared by 2, I end up with x squared. I have to divide everything by 2. When I divide 8x by 2, I get 4x. When I divide the 6 by 2, I get 3. When I divide 0 by 2, I get 0 again. So this one turns out nice. I don't end up with fractions. But fractions are okay. Fractions are our friends. So divide everything by 2 before I start. Now let's do the step 1.5 here, just to show how we would do it. Let's get the x squared plus bx by itself. So I'm going to subtract 3 from both sides. So I get x squared plus 4x equals -3. So this can make it a little easier to work with. Well, we just did this problem, didn't we? What is b here? B equals 4. B over 2 squared was b over 4 divided by 2 is 4, right? So b over 2 is 4. I'm going to add that to both sides. So x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals -3 plus 4 is 1. Now I'm going to rewrite this side as a perfect square. This is x, just to write out the steps, x plus 2. I'm going to factor it as x plus 2 times x plus 2 equals 1. So this is x plus 2 squared equals 1. Take the square root of both sides now to finish. square root undoes the square, so I get x plus 2 equals plus or minus 1. And then I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. So x equals negative 3. Or x equals negative 1. Is everybody good with this? So our homework tonight is just practicing solving quadratic equations by completing the square. Just a little review. All right. So our homework is on page, it's a strange page, A56. All right, there you go.